Well, hello, my friends. Welcome back for another week of our Accelerated ID series. My name is Shawntay Skilldagger, and I'll be your host for our episode today. And our episode today is all about managing ID project scope creep. We're going to talk about some things that you can do to mitigate scope creep from happening just by setting up your project the right way. How about we get started with a quick question? What is scope creep? If you have any experience with project management at all, or maybe you've just heard the word scope creep, I would like to know what that means to you. When you think of scope creep related to instructional design, what do you think that means? In order to know what scope creep is, we might need to talk about what scope is. So, whenever we're talking about scope, we're talking about what are the parameters of a project that we have all agreed on for that project. So, basically, it's where we have defined what we're going to do in that project and who is going to do it, what those deliverables are. So, upfront at the beginning of a project. So when you're thinking about this from the perspective of instructional design and maybe using the ADDIE model, in our analysis phase, we often have what we call a kickoff meeting. And in that kickoff meeting, we define what the requirements, i.e., the scope is for that project. So, what do you think scope creep is? And it looks like Kim says changes that require more time and resources. And Kim, that's exactly right. So, good job. And here are some examples, right? So, we have our little scope creep monster over there going num num num, right? Just like really chomping at the bit to increase the scope. So as instructional designers, scope creep could look like any of these things. You're like where you're working with a stakeholder and that stakeholder is like, "Hey Lynn, I know that we agreed on this scope, but hey, can we add a quick little video over here to model this thing?" And now that's new scope because that's not something that we agreed on at the beginning of the project. Or it could show up in the form of, like, I know that we only budgeted for these 4 lessons, but hey, can we squeeze in one more lesson in there? Or maybe you get all the way through the project or near the end of the project and someone comes along and goes, you know what? We just finished our rebrand, and it would be really great if we could go and rebrand all of these slides in the playbook to match the new rebrand. So now we've got more work that wasn't planned. Or maybe, there's a new learning and you've already built out all of this stuff in the old learning management system. And somebody comes along and goes, "Hey, I know that we've already done that. And I know that we're starting next week, but can we go ahead and migrate everything over?" So now we've got all this new project scope creep related to our instructional design project. So, in fact, scope creep is like a weed. It might start small with one little thing like, "Oh, Shante, can you just add like this 1 to 2 minute little how to video?" And you say yes, right? You've opened the door to that yes. And then before you know it, like scope creep is out of control and it can totally derail your project. You can no longer deliver that project on budget. You can no longer deliver that project on time because we just added in so many little things along the way, right? If you look at each thing that people ask just by itself, it might be small, but whenever you're looking at it in the context of the larger project, one change might influence multiple parts of that project. So we just have to be very careful about what we say yes to. So let's talk about some of the things that can cause us to have scope creep. So something that can contribute to this is at the very beginning when we have that project kickoff that we don't have clear project objectives or we don't have clear documented project requirements, right? So we don't do a good job in that analysis phase of saying, okay, so we're going to build this module in storyline. It's going to be approximately 20 minutes. It's going to have one video, we've got to be really clear about what we're asking for. Sometimes we can set ourselves up for failure by allowing somebody to defer letting us know what they want. And what I mean by defer, and this actually, I was in this situation today with a stakeholder who was saying, "I don't really know what I want until I see it." So if you could just pilot it, like if you could just go do your thing and then just pilot it, then I'll give you my feedback about what it is that I'm looking for. And I had to explain, like we that's like throwing a whole bunch of noodles up on the wall and seeing what sticks. And that really doesn't set any of us up for success. So we've got to get really clear right now about what are the objectives of this? What is it that you want these participants to be able to do? What does success look like? So we had to just pause and get clear about we have to do this, these foundational pieces to like get this whole project set up to define what this scope is in order to successfully execute this project. When we don't take the time to do that, we might go out and build something that is nowhere near remotely what the stakeholder wants. So we cannot allow them to defer defining what their requirements are until you build the thing and they see it. That's just going to lead to a whole bunch of rework and frustration on the parts of many. So from my this to me, one of the things that I was thinking whenever I was preparing for this is, sometimes when I go shopping, and you all can let me know if you do this too, sometimes I go shopping and I have no idea what I want. But I always say something like, I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it. Right. Well, that works whenever I'm just trying to fill my time to go shopping. Like maybe I know that I want a new pair of pants or I want a new outfit for Friday night. But managing a project, an ID project, isn't the same thing as window shopping, right? I, whenever we are managing an ID project, we've got to know up front exactly what it is that we are looking for and what we are responsible for. So we have to hit that pause button. We have to tell our stakeholders, no, we can't defer that till later. We've got to be clear about what we want right now. Another cause of scope creep here is failure to identify and manage risk effectively. A lot of times when we're starting out with a project, we know that there are some risks. And so we want to make sure that we document those because if we fail to acknowledge those and we encounter them later, then we're going to be spending time adding scope to address those things. Other things that can get in the way of or cause scope creep are unrealistic project timelines or resource constraints. And so, where we see this as instructional designers who are managing projects is again in that analysis phase. So, if we have an expedited timeline or a timeline that is unrealistic, we might try to take some shortcuts at the beginning to try and buy some time back in our timeline. So maybe we don't stop and pause and do a good job of vetting what the requirements of the project are. We're like, okay, all right, so you want this project on customer service. Great. All right, I'm going to go build something on customer service. But if we don't really stop and pause and we don't really like niche into what are the behavior changes that we need to see in our employees in order to meet that customer service need. So again, it's really important that we just take the time to really, really vet what the needs of the project are, which of course relates to this incomplete requirements. And then another cause of scope creep can be stakeholder pressure and even influence. So, maybe that we shouldn't do something, but then you have a VP that comes along and says, hey, Shawntay, I really need you to include this 1 to 2 minute video. And so we feel like we're pressured. We feel like we're not in a position to say no, whether it's true or not. Sometimes we just feel that by another person's position. Or sometimes somebody else like comes in and they try to influence what the scope is, right? So we've just got to be very careful of some of these things and call them out when we see them. And then my favorite, the number one thing that I like to talk to my team about, the number one thing that I see as a contributor to scope creep is when the instructional designer or the ID project manager fails to explain the consequences. Like our role as instructional designers, like we've got to have high ownership, right? If this is our project, we are responsible for delivering it on a certain day, it's certain hours, certain dollar amount, then we have to explain the consequences of adding new scope into that project. So my team often hears me say, yes, we can do that. But if we do that, then we're going to extend this timeline by 2 weeks. Or, yes, we can do that. But if you really need this and you need this date, then we're going to have to peel out some of these other pieces to make space for it. So, whenever you have a project timeline that you are working with, that project timeline is meant to be within your work hours, right? Within your capacity. So none of us should have to work 80 hours in a week to account for this added scope. So we've got to be in this conversation or in this dialogue around, yes, we can, but here's the consequence. Yes, we can, but that means we can't do this other thing. So as instructional designers, we've got to see ourselves as equals in the conversation so that we can push back and say, yes, we can do that, but, or no, we cannot do that for version 1 and still meet this timeline. But if this is really important, then we can put this on our backlog. And whenever we iterate and we go into building version 2, then we can add this feature into the project, right? So we've just got to be in conversation and dialogue about what is realistic given the scope and the timeline that we have, and then what can be carried into a future iteration of that project. All right. So I've said a lot about some of these causes of scope creep. I see someone here has a question. How long did it take for you as an ID before you felt confident in your ability to estimate what is realistic? This is a really great question. Do you have tools or spreadsheets that help to navigate approximately how much time or budget various types of requests tend to add for reference? Really great questions. So, number one, I want to own right here in front of the world that when my first year of instructional design, I had crazy imposter syndrome. So I would just sit there and go, oh, okay, yes, okay, yeah, we can do that. And, maybe on the inside, I'm like, how the hell am I going to do that? Right. I mean, that's a completely unrealistic timeline. And so I'd work late into the night. I would work the weekends. I would turn myself inside out to get that done, where I really should have used my voice and said, yes, but, or if we do that, then we can't do this. Or if you want that, we're going to have to push this timeline out. So what that really took for me to get that voice was for me to like really push myself way too hard in order to meet the deliverables and get totally burned out. Scope creep has consequences. So if scope creep does happen, and I know that we've kind of talked about these organically as we were talking about these different scenarios, but definitely a timeline delay. And that can be really problematic if there is a really hard deadline for when something needs to be delivered. So timeline delays are a potential consequence. Resource allocation challenges. And what we mean by this is if you add scope, maybe you add scope and you were working on something that now requires some sort of graphic design from this particular graphic designer that's on the marketing team. Well, not all people in other departments are just available at our leisure, right? So now we may have an allocation challenge where I need some of that person's capacity, but they're not free for 6 weeks, which now that can impact my timeline because I need their capacity in order to finish my project. So we've got to pay attention to that. Or if something gets pushed out and then when I'm ready to work on it, that person is now on vacation for 2 weeks. So now I have to wait for them to come back from vacation. And all of these things can increase my timeline. Or another consequence is decreased quality, where, if I'm trying to rush through and get more in because I've really got to beat this deadline, maybe I don't do as good of a job. And then sometimes it could result in strained relationships too, right? Because we're asking more of people or we're in arguments with people like, I needed that yesterday in order to do this. So we've just got to be very careful with allowing scope creep into our instructional design projects because there are a lot of negative consequences. All right, so let's talk about how you can avoid scope creep. So we're going to run through these and then we're going to do some scenarios that you all can react to, okay? So to avoid scope creep up front, we want to define our objectives. What are our deliverables? We also want to establish our success criteria and we want to document this. So in my process, I have a scope document that has a series of questions. We also often create a project brief. And maybe in that project brief, I say, these are the total amount of hours that we have available for this project. This is by when I need this project finished. And then there will be a link that goes into the scope document that has everything defined. And once we're all in agreement, then we would take that and we would put that into our project management board. Other things that we can do are to communicate boundaries and limitations. So, for example, if somebody's saying, can't you just add this video? It's only going to take a couple of hours. Well, you can say, well, I really planned, this project using 100% of my instructional design capacity to get this done. So I really don't have 2 to 3 extra hours. In order to make that happen, that means that we're going to have to either pull this out or we're going to have to extend this project a day, or maybe we need to pass this off to someone else who can do it. So we just have to be in communication about what the limitations are and what the boundaries are. And then it's also helpful if there's an actual change management process. So if somebody comes and says, hey, can we add this video? Well, maybe our process is, well, let's have a quick huddle about that. Let's get clear on what the expectations of those videos are, or that video, what that is, how long it is, what resources are available, who's going to build it. So you just get really clear on the requirements so that you can then go, oh, well, it might have only been a 1 to 2 minute video, but based on what you're telling me, that's really going to take about 8 to 10 hours to build, which means, X, Y, Z. And then always prioritizing our requirements. So, what has the highest priority? What are the dependencies? Meaning, you have to get this done before you do this other thing. So, these are just some strategies that we could use to help manage or prevent project scope creep. I think one of the biggest things is that early upfront, we define those requirements, we communicate those requirements to everybody, we send it out email, it is documented. We have check-in meetings along the way to let people know where we are in the process. When somebody tries to throw in added scope, and they will 100% of the time, you be prepared as the instructional designer to say, yes, but, or no, not right now, but in B.2, we can do that. All right, so let's do a little practice. We've got Braulio Antonio. He is our vice president of sales, and he is asking that the L&D team develop an online training course focused on developing his sales people. Then we have Morgan Maxwell, who is our lead instructional designer. So Morgan met with Braulio. She went through the whole analysis phase. She defined the requirements, and she used that to define the scope. She used that to figure out which exact sales techniques they need to be knowledgeable about, what the customer relationship management components are. She created a project plan, she set the timelines, and she got everybody on the project that needs to be involved. Okay. So now we're underway. Then, after a few weeks, Braulio comes along again. Remember, Braulio is the vice president of sales, and Braulio says, hey, can we add another module on negotiation skills? I mean, just like 20 to 30 minutes. Can we add that module in? Now I want you all to channel Morgan, who is an empowered instructional designer. How might Morgan respond to this new scope request? So remember, she is the lead instructional designer. She is working with the vice president of sales. You have a deadline by which this course needs to be developed. And now this vice president of sales has asked for a new module on negotiation skills. Absolutely not. No, just kidding. Yeah. We can do that. But if we do, we will need to change our timeline. Yes, but that will set the project back by about 2 weeks. Great job. Awesome. Love these. Tell him that the deadline will change, or let's have a meeting about this. I'd like to walk through that. Excellent. Ask clarifying questions. All really good responses. Let's look at scenario number 2. We have a customization request. So our HR manager comes in and says, hey, I really love this sales training that you are putting together. I think some of our global subsidiaries, their sales force could also benefit from this. So do you think that you can work on language for our top 5 markets in Europe? Can you do some different regional customizations? So what do we say to our HR manager that is now asking us to increase our scope by having some of these localization customizations incorporated into this build? What do you think our how do you think Morgan, our lead instructional designer, should respond to this new request? I mean, it's great that our HR manager is very excited about what we are doing and wants to expand it into other markets, but that wasn't our initial request. So, what is it that you think Morgan should do in this scenario? Sure, that's possible, but that would be a different project. Can we meet about the specifics of this in the timeline? Treat it like a brand new project. Let's get the standard training out first and localize it to other regions as a second phase. Absolutely. These are all great responses and exactly as I would train you to do that if you were a member of my team. Great job. All right. So here is our last scenario for you to reflect on. So, we often work with subject matter experts whenever we are building learning solutions. And so, we had our scope of our project, all of our key stakeholders, including our subject matter expert, signed off on it. We are well underway, we are working. And then all of a sudden, our subject matter expert pops up and provides additional content, may even have already written the content and the resources that they believe should be included in the course. And they come to you and you're like, hey, I built all these new lessons. Can we put this in here? Or, hey, I collected all these resources. Can we include this in this sales training? So, what did we do? Remember, her job is to own this project, deliver it on time, on budget, and meet the requirements of the defined scope that were agreed upon at the very beginning. So, how might Morgan respond to the subject matter expert's response or request? This is great stuff. Let's put it in the resources for now and add it at a later time. I like that answer. These are great resources. However, we are nearing the end of our deadline and I won't be able to include all of this. However, I've pulled out the critical need to know information and we are still able to meet our agreed upon deadline. Meet to review current progress and review areas that could be added to or adjusted. Awesome. Well, you all did a great job. Excellent job. I can tell that you will be great project managers of your ID projects whenever you are ready to lead them. I'll give you just a couple of other pieces of information so that we'll be ready to wrap up. So, number one, if you haven't been out to acceleratedid.com, there are some great resources out there for aspiring instructional designers. We would love for you to look at those and let us know if there are any additional resources that you would benefit from. So, thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed our accelerated ID episode on managing ID project scope creep. All the best. I'll see you soon. Bye.